Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for being here. Time to roll after a few days. It seems like forever. It was just Friday, though, that we were here last, and now it's Monday. Happy Monday. Welcome back. And I appreciate your being here. Just when you think the human race is destined for obliteration, self obliteration, extermination, extinction, and all of those things, something comes along that just brightens your mood a little bit. I always used to like to say, well, my neighborhood's pretty good, but just a little while ago here, we have an ice cream truck that comes through our town, and my kids were all out playing with the neighbor kids down at the little park at the end of the street. And we saw the ice cream truck go by, and we've seen it before, and we waved. Said, no kids today. They're all down playing. And so then the kids, of course, all come running back within about 3 minutes. And they all want, here's the ice cream truck. Do we have money? Who has money? And so we dug out a little bit of coin, and because we knew it was making the loop and coming back around the block. And as our street has no outlet. And so my kids all ran up and got themselves a popsicle or some stupid, cheap, cartoon-shaped piece of ice cream that's worth about 4 cents, and you pay $1.50 for. So my kids all get something, and in all the confusion, they were with the neighbor girl and their mom down the street, and so they came walking back home. And the neighbor girl's kind of crying because she missed the ice cream truck. And I looked at Rainey and we said, oh man, we didn't think of their friend. I thought they had all gone home. And so I walked down and I said hi to the mom. I said, pardon the faux pas, the social faux pas of my children and me. I said, we didn't think about your daughter and sorry about that. And she said, oh, that's okay. She said, we've got stuff. And the little girl's kind of crying. And so then out runs from behind me my little 4-year-old girl. Now, she didn't hear this conversation because we're out on the curb now compared to up at the house. My little 4-year-old Ellery comes running down and runs over to her friend and hands her unopened chocolate fudge sickle. And she goes, here, you can have mine. And I looked at my little girl, and I got to tell you what, that makes us a dad. When we got back in the house, I said, I just want to tell you something, Ellery. I said, do you know how proud Daddy is of you? I said, that was such a nice thing for you to do. And she just kind of smiled sheepishly, and I gave her a kiss on the head and a big hug. And then she looks up at me and she says, we can go to the gas station and get me something right now, right? I said, of course we can. So anyway, I thought I would share that with you. On the brink of civilization's demise, you have the heart of a 4-year-old who does something like that. So that made me very proud. And so there you go. How's that for opening up tonight? And I want to start welcoming some of you for being here. Audrey, big hugs right back at you. Good to see you. Oh, wait, those were for Susie. Never mind. I just stepped into a hug that wasn't mine. I thought it said Scotty at first glance out of the corner of my eye. But nice to have you here, Audrey, and big hugs to you. And let's see. Who else we got? We got Susie Q. We got Chris Jones. Aloha, brother. And Michelle, good to see you here. James, as usual, good to see you. And anybody else sneak in right here at the very embryonic stages of the show? Johan, Dancing Gypsy, good to have you here. And I think I got everybody so far. As the room begins to populate. Oh, I'm seeing my own. Did you get an announcement for this before we started at 9:00? Because I set a reminder for myself on this every time, and it always pops up when I'm about 5 minutes into the show. It sends an alert. So, James, it's going well. Thank you for asking. And pardon the little cough. I'm still not reaching for the cough button. It's almost all gone. So it's feeling much better. Richie, good to see you. Chasing Somer, and good to have you here. And so, folks, we've been talking about King David, and I want to do just a brief recap. Just David, the story as we're telling it, is really an examination of pulling apart the biblical tale, which is a wonderful story that most of us grew up with, and many points of we know because the story is so legendary and so famous. Yet it's an apologetic. It is if you study history for any length of time, especially ancient history, and you start looking at stories like this, you can start to pull out the literary parts of the tale and say, well, there's something underneath this that's probably true or maybe true. And then there are some elements that maybe aren't true at all. And that's what we're finding in this whole story of David, is that the biblical account is really an apologetic. I was going through and looking some of the comments after last Friday's show was over, and I missed a couple of points that people were making during the show live and a couple of questions. But I will say that you can look at these things and start to determine what's apologetic and what is a literal part of the tale. And so the question came up somewhere in there, and I think it's come up before, is what does learning that a story like this is in fact full of fictional embellishments for the sake of building an apologetic, what does that do to the other stories in the Bible then? What does that do to the faith elements in the story? What does that do if you have a faith that these things were true? Does it suddenly start to make you ask the question, well, is none of this true then at all? I would have to say this. There's a way I've described this in the past, and that is when I run into people who say the Bible is all fiction. I go, no, it's not. That's ridiculous. It's not all fiction. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Bible's history has been substantiated through archaeological finds, historical records uncovered, things like that. There's still a lot of questions out there, of course, but the history is pretty intact. But what you've got are, like you're seeing in this David story, the faith element of the story is always wrapped around this kernel of truth that's at the center. So if you could say, did the kingdom of David exist? The house of David? Yeah, I think it's a pretty established fact that the house of David exists. Although you still have your naysayers out there, your skeptics, your historical skeptics that want to say even the archaeological facts that they found, there's something wrong with them. They're from way back. Somebody's telling a story 3,000 years ago about that historical item that we found. So I kind of poo-poo that. And I say, you know what? The history can be efficacious. It's the faith story. You have freedom to decide whether or not you want to believe that. And what I have found is that many of the stories in the Bible have an apologetic tone or items added or embellishments to make the story more rounded and to fit. And I say, why do that if the story is true? So that's where some of my questions have come in. And I just have to comment. You say it's wet in Hawaii today. Possible flooding later on, says Chris Jones. It's been wet here, but it's been hot and humid, and it's finally coming down a little bit. Humidity's dropping. It's going from 100 degrees now down to about, I think we topped out at like 88 today. So we're going to have a nice couple of cool days just to counter what's going on in Hawaii, way over there out in the ocean. So this is my take on the biblical story. And you've got two major faiths that are built on the Bible story, and a third that's an offshoot of it. The three major Abrahamic faiths that exist. That's Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And they all sprout from kind of the same source point. So you've got millions of people in the world presently, and millions of upon millions of people in the past that have believed these stories to be true. Um, I I have a problem with that only in the sense that, say, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they all have their certain structures that all mirror each other in form, in style, in practice, even though the facts are all changed. Are we all right or are we all wrong? That's the thing you have to look at. When I was growing up in the Baptist church, everybody else, of course, was hell-bound sinners because they weren't in the same belief structure that we were. The one that says Jesus was the only efficacy, the only redemption of sin. And so we were taught that. But Islam is taught something different. And Judaism is taught that the Messiah isn't even here yet. And so you've got all these faiths that are all built out of this one book, yet, that at least sourced themselves in that book, in some of the background history of that book. And so, what do you do when history and fact and archaeology, sociology, anthropology all starts to contradict what is contained in the scripture on a belief level? And that's where I hit the what would you call it, the brick wall in my faith, was trying to understand why all these religions basically did the same thing and basically believed a different version of, but God never stepped in to try to clarify the matter, to tell us which one was true. So this is where I started down this road of asking those questions. And this is why I have this apologetic of David that I'm looking at. This is why I start to pull these things apart, is to say what's really here. Not what am I taught is here, not what do I think is here, not what did I one day learn was here, but what do we know for sure? And even when doing this, we have to speculate a little bit about what's there. Even in the apologetic, there is some speculation, but that speculation is based upon everything else in the apologetic that seems to be established, is indicating that these other things we have questions about just might be the same type of thing. And we've run into a couple of those as we've been doing this series. So I encourage you all to not let anything I'm saying shake the foundations of your faith or your individual spirituality. What I want you to do is ask questions about what's beneath that. Faith has to have a foundation. Faith just can't be blind. Well, it can be, I suppose, but what good does that do you? I could have faith that this pencil will someday save my soul. Oh, the great pencil. But I could believe that, but what's my foundation for believing that? So ask yourself about what you believe based on what you know. I know there's biblical teaching that says faith is that what is it? The evidence of things not seen. The why am I'm suddenly slipping on the verse. The substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, or it might be the other way around. And so I get that part. But what I want to know is what really happened there. What is the founding of this? Why, when the Messiah suddenly needed to become somebody that was a descendant of the King David, of David's line, that's based on the biblical story that we see. Well, what if you learn that the biblical story isn't so? Why would what we have learned about David so far, why would David be somebody from whom the messianic line should spring? Other than maybe David's, I always believed this. I taught this even when I was in the faith, that there are two aspects of faith. There is experiential and there is positional. Positional meant My faith is like this linear line. It just rides along this line. It doesn't change. It goes along in a line. Its position is its sound. It's there. It's solid. Nothing can change it. Experience goes like a roller coaster along that line. So sometimes my experience is up, sometimes it's down, sometimes up, sometimes down. So I used to tell, when I was a youth pastor, would tell the kids, your faith and your position with God is set and established. It's the hard line, while your experience can fluctuate and go up and down. And I said, experience, it's like when we talk politics, facts versus feelings. My feelings go up and down, but the fact is the line. And so this is what I like to bring to historical study as well. The apologetic, or the stories that we learn, are sometimes like that roller coaster. They're up and down. They're built on feelings. They're built on things that are meant to make you feel something. They're built on things that are trying to make you bolster your faith. That's why the stories are embellished. Yet the story itself, at the baseline, the foundation, is straight and secure and solid. We may not know all the facts to fill in everything along that line, but we can start to tell when things look like they've been tampered with and embellished. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. And I see there's a few comments. I want to see Scott Dower. You gave up on religion when you were told that you were going to hell because your wife cheated on you and divorced you. Wait a minute. You're going to hell because your wife cheated on you and divorced you? So you're going to hell? That's interesting. I know that in our faith, there was all kinds of prohibitions on divorce. And that you were out of God's will if you did this and that and the other things. So let's see. Kat says, wanted to say hi. Love you all. Running low on data. Love you all. Earth Familia. Keep the pencils away from John Wayne. Whatever that means, Kat, I'll do my best. Let's see. Audrey says, don't mention shaking foundations. I'll bet not. Yes, it's nice to have Audrey in here after last Friday's earthquakes. Glad you made it. Glad your house is safe, and all of that. So let's see. What was James Sheet saying? Don't ask Scotty. Let's see. Bible was written by many people, then copied many more, adding their own styles. Chris, that's true, but to a certain extent, maybe this is why James didn't want you to ask. I took some textual criticisms courses when I was in my seminary days. And you can have different interpretations of the Bible, but what you've got to do is pare it down and go back to as original as we can get. In other words, like the Codex A, the Codex B, there's the Septuagint, there's all these things. So, way to go, Audrey. But at least you're on top of things. So when I talk about going back to like the Septuagint, I've mentioned many times that the Septuagint was the rewriting of the Hebrew scriptures. Remember, Moses wrote the Pentateuch probably right around 1400 BCE. So you're looking at 3,400 years ago. And then when Israel was sacked by Babylon and carried off into captivity, all hauled off to Babylon, they leveled the place. After the return in about the 400 to 500s BCE, it was the 72 rabbis who went to the Library of Alexandria to see if they could recompile the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, which had all been burned and were gone, except perhaps maybe copies that were at the Library of Alexandria. And so they sat there and they set these 72 rabbis. And remember the oral tradition in the Jewish faith, where they would, like even you think of just a bar mitzvah where they're quoting scripture. This is all the oral tradition. So they all sat down and they wrote down in 72 different cells, wrote down what they knew of the oral tradition. And then they scoured through any of the books and scrolls that were in the Library of Alexandria. They recreated the Old Testament text, which is what we find in the Septuagint. That was the result of what they created. And so that Septuagint is basically what you have in our Old Testament today. You pick up an old Bible, look at the Old Testament, that's the Septuagint. translated into English. And so now it doesn't mean that there aren't portions that were retranslated and edited or whatever. We've got a lot of that. But this is why I think, in part, things like the story of Moses, the story of the Exodus, you don't have any kings mentioned by name. Either Moses did that deliberately, or they could find no record and they couldn't remember what the names were. And Moses had maybe originally put them there. We don't know, because we'll never have that. But when you're looking at a version of the Bible today, remember, there are translations that are different. There are transliterations. There are amplified translations. All of that translation doesn't mean anything if you go back to the original text. As far back as we can go is within maybe 200 or 300 years of the time of Christ to get some of the New Testament texts, as old as we have manuscripts of. What you don't know is if those manuscripts had been altered back in their day in order to amplify the story. So getting back to the story of David, I believe the story of David, this is a question somebody asked on Friday. When was this all written? Oh, I think it was probably during David's lifetime, or at least it was a contemporary of David. Like I said, I think that David had scribes writing things down. I think David, this is a speculation, but he probably mandated that these writers embellish certain parts of the story. And so that's what I think you have going on here. So anyway, what's shaking, says Iowa. Good question. Ask Audrey. She'll say nothing, hopefully. So anyway, let's see. Iowa, good to see you here. Kat, good to see you here. I already went through a little bit. Ron, good to see you, brother. Glad to have you here. And I think that's about everybody who is showing their face anyway in the chat room. So let's move into the story for tonight. And let's see kind of where we can get here. I've got to call up my notes, so give me just a second here as I do this. And let's see. Oops, cancel that. Hold on a second. So as I'm doing this, how was your day? Did you have a good time at work? I didn't do this ahead of time like I was supposed to do. So there we go. I'm right where I left off. So I'm just going to recap, or not recap. I'm going to tie a little bit of a knot in what we were talking about last time, because we ended with the death of Absalom. And there was a little bit of an aftermath with that leads up to this next section we're going to talk about, which is David and Bathsheba. And the change in David's power after Absalom's rebellion was almost immediate. Right after Absalom's death, the rebel son was now dead. And the throne was empty because David's been, he didn't abdicate, he was ousted. And so it was David's for the retaking at this point. But David remained in the city of Mahanaim, and the man who had brought all of Israel to its knees was now incapable of returning, because the people who had reluctantly accepted his rule in the past had been empowered by the momentary success of Absalom's revolt. And if you're reading between the lines on this, the Bible does say in the story that David had this struggle with the people. And this tells you something. Is this the great David that they honor? Or is this the David who was the asshole, who was the conqueror, who forced himself upon the throne and left a bloody trail behind him, over which he had to have this apologetic written to make it look like he was clean of all of this stuff? So the man who brought all of Israel to its knees by force and had taken the throne now wasn't going back to the throne right away. The people kind of were rejecting him. And yet, at least according to the biblical text, the Israelites, the inhabitants of the north, were uncertain of what they wanted to do next. They didn't know what they wanted to do. Absalom's dead. They were supporting him. Now here is David, who could just walk right back into the throne. So David's in exile. He's out of the country, remember, just across the Jordan. And Absalom's dead. The original royal family of Saul had been wiped out. Someone had to sit on the throne. Someone had to protect them. Remember, this was the duty of the king. If any of Israel's enemies realized that no one was in charge, the nation would be open to easy conquest. And their tribal enemies, defeated at Mahanaim, had returned to their homes and were in no position to be raised again anytime soon. David, for all of his faults, had successfully protected Israel from the Philistines and the Ammonites, the longtime antagonists of the northern tribes. And it seemed that there was little choice. For the north, the fall of Absalom meant, without a question, the return to David. Now, the Bible doesn't really make it sound that way. It makes it sound like there's a rebellion. David had to run off and he had to fight the battle. Now he's going to go back to the throne. There was more question than that. Judah to the south now was a completely other matter. This had been the heartland of Absalom's. He'd been a Judahite. He was born and crowned in Hebron, the original capital of Judah under David. The northern and southern tribes weren't so deeply intertwined that the decision was one of necessarily that of the other. They didn't always support each other. And while the north had effectively acquiesced to David's return to power, David still had to deal with the south. Now, this is his homeland, too. And until the situation in Judah was settled, he wouldn't be able to return to Jerusalem as the king. And so he had taken control of Judah through diplomacy once. Could he do it again? And so he sent words to his priests. Remember that he left back at Jerusalem Zadok and Abiathar, who had ostensibly maintained their neutrality throughout the Absalom rebellion by staying with the ark in Jerusalem. They were holy men. Well, we're the priests. We don't take sides. We're on God's side. Shalom. And so he had to figure out who that they were, first of all, credible to the people. And so he told them, the priests, to speak to the elders of Judah and appealed to David's old Judahite origins and requested that Judah reunite and return David to the throne. And at the same time, Zadok and Abiathar were known to be two of David's oldest compatriots. So to add an extra level of force to his request, David turned to someone who was known not to have any affection for him and whose credibility was therefore unimpeachable, Amasa, Absalom's general. So now he calls this third party in. Now, Amasa is introduced in the Bible for the first time as Absalom's personally appointed army commander. But his lineage is also provided. And it turns out that he's Joab's cousin. Joab, who's Joab? David's cousin, who is David's general. And therefore, David's nephew. Think of how that works. So you can figure out the family line there. So, in retrospect, this makes sense. Absalom's coup was from within. As a member of the royal family, he wouldn't have had access to anyone outside of David's administration. And this is why his main advisor, Ahithophel, was David's former counselor. Remember? David sent Ahithophel to be a spy. And it seems more than likely that his general Amasa had also been this high-ranking officer in David's military. So after all, David's commanders were, like Saul's, family members. And when whatever role Amasa might have played in David's army, he had sacrificed it when he threw his allegiance behind Absalom. So how's David feel about this guy? So now it's significant that David approached Amasa for support in his return to the throne. And it also required that David gives him something in return. So David told Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, to send a message to Amasa saying, excuse me, aren't you my own flesh and blood? May God do thus and more to me if you do not become my army commander permanently in place of Joab. That's in 2 Samuel 19. And although the appeal to kinship ties may have struck Amasa as somewhat disingenuous at this point, because David had just had the second of his sons killed, the appeal to Amasa's ego and the offer of Joab's position was no doubt pretty hard to refuse. Put yourself in context of the times. So Zadok and Abiathar are never said to have fulfilled their mission to the elders of Judah, but Amasa did his job. It no doubt made a major impression to have Absalom's generals supporting David. The guy who had just tried to pull the coup and died for it, his general has now been repatriated and is standing for the old king. And so not only does this indicate that Absalom's establishment had shifted its support to David, which surely helped with the popular perception of David's power at this point, but it also meant more practically that Israel's anti-David army was no more. They didn't exist because their general is now David's general. And so just as Abner's defection had signaled the end of Ishbaal's ability to fight David, Amasa's defection did the same for Absalom's supporters. So like the army in the north, the army of Judah had dispersed after the defeat at Mahanaim, and now its commander himself from Judah had announced his allegiance to David, his uncle. So Judah was hardly in a position to refuse Amasa's overtures on David's behalf. The message from Judah was sent to David, "Come back with all your followers." That's what Judah said. That's what they decided. David, guess what, folks? He won again. So now this royal procession back across the Jordan was this grand symbolic moment and an opportunity for some individuals to make personal gestures of support or self-abasement before the returning king. The first of these was Shimei, the northerner who had hurled stones and insults at David. Remember that? As David was leaving the city with his people, Shimei's throwing rocks and insults at David. His appearance before David confirms for us that the North had agreed to have David come back as king. Shimei, therefore, had reason to ask for David's forgiveness, now that the man he had tarred as a murderer was returning to power. David, however, swore not to kill Shimei, much to Abishai's astonishment. Again, and David's rare show of leniency is readily explained, not as the Bible does, as a display of grace, but rather in simple political terms. David didn't forgive Shimei out of the grace. By grace, I give you mercy. It was for political terms. David's rule in the north was hanging by a thread. And the result, not of his great power, but of the Israelites' need for anyone, to be that spearhead that protects the nation, that protects them all in times of invasion. So the murder of an Israelite, even before David had made his way to Jerusalem, likely would have incited a fresh wave of resentment. David was in no position to make more enemies in the north. He had to let Shimei live. It's a political decision. I get it. You don't blame him. He had to play politics to a certain extent. So I don't think the point I'm making on a faith side is that he's not giving the man grace. He's letting him live due to politics. So Ziba, Saul's former steward, whom David had given control of Meribaal's royal estate. Remember Meribal? He's the one son that's left over, or grandson, I think he is, hanging out there of Saul's, crippled. Also appeared before the king. And he had more personally at stake in David's kingship than most, as he controlled his property, Meribaal's property. Remember, Meribaal's under house arrest. He shall never not eat at the king's table the rest of his days, which was basically saying you're under house arrest in the palace. So it's like being in the Tower of London a little bit, I suppose. So this is all entirely on David's word. Now, a new king would have no reason to uphold David's agreement with Ziba. A show of respect and heartfelt welcome was therefore appropriate, but along with Ziba came Meribaal himself, who had more to account for. For Mirabal had not gone into exile with David alongside the rest of the royal court and royal family. He chose instead to stay in Jerusalem and await the arrival of Absalom. So Mirabal's decision may be chalked up to his infirmity. Couldn't walk very well. It would have been physically difficult, if not impossible, for him to have made a trek through the wilderness and all the way across the Jordan into the Transjordan. But Ziba explained it to David differently. Mirabal, he said, stayed in Jerusalem, hoping that somehow he might attain the northern kingship that was rightfully his. Mirabal declares Ziba to be a liar. But of course, he was that was Ziba, by the way, that explained that. If I misspoke there, Ziba said Mirabal just stayed here so he could get the northern kingdom, which is rightfully his. He believes that. But Mirabal says Ziba's lying. He says, but of course, he has every reason to say that. It's possible that Mirabal had hoped Absalom might really return things to the way they were before David, including the restoration of an independent northern kingdom of Israel. So Absalom would rule in Judah, where his rebellion was centered, and Mirabal naturally would rule in the north. So as Absalom hardly ruled long enough to affect any changes at all, we'll never know what his intentions were. Though it's hard to believe that he willingly would have relinquished his command of the north, won by his father, to a descendant of Saul, who the people might not have looked to strongly, other than the Sauline linkage, due to his physical infirmities. So in any case, Mirabal had to explain his stay in Jerusalem, and thus his apparent support for Absalom. All he could do was beg for mercy from David. And David, upon learning that Mirabal would not accompany him, had formerly transferred all of Mirabal's estates to Ziba, the guy who's now accusing Mirabal. Now that Mirabal was before him asking for forgiveness, David, as the story goes, declared that Mirabal and Ziba would split the royal estate equally between them. Now, this decision seems almost Solomonic. Remember the woman who brings the baby to Solomon, and they couldn't figure out who the mother was. And the one mother says, it's mine. She stole my baby when hers died and changed them. And so Solomon suggests, well, we'll just cut the baby down the middle and you'll each have a half, which wasn't a solution. It was a way to force the real mother to say, let the other mother have him. And this was supposed to be, the wisdom of Solomon. And so perhaps it's too neat an arrangement to be true, this dividing the land up. So the authors want to show David as being very gracious, but at the same time, they must have known that he did not in fact divide Saul's estate, but he gave it in its entirety to Ziba. So they have Mirabal responding to David's division of the property by formally renouncing his claim to it. Let him take it all, since the Lord my king has come home safe, says Mirabal. In other words, David did the gracious thing, and if Saul's estate ended up entirely in Ziba's hands, it was Mirabal's own decision. But Mirabal would be allowed to live for the same reason that Shimei was pardoned. Any Saulite death at this point was political suicide in the north for David. So there you go. This is how, this is the aftermath of Absalom. This is how David now has to resort things, kind of reset the chess pieces. And so the last person to present himself to the king was Barzillai the Gileadite, who had, say that fast 3 times, Barzillai the Gileadite, who had provided David with supplies during the stay at Menahem. He was not obligated to David in any way, nor did he need David's forgiveness. He accompanied him merely as a show of respect, made all the more remarkable by his advanced age. David requested that Barzillai spend his final years in Jerusalem as David's honored guest. But Barzillai refused. Instead, he offered Chimham, his most likely Barzillai's son, as one whom David could honor in that way. This was effectively an international treaty between David, and Gilead, and one that reaffirmed that it was the Transjordanians who were vassals to David and not the other way around. So, with the formalities out of the way, David and his men continue to cross the Jordan and back to Israel. And at this point, the Bible describes a really remarkable debate. All the men of Israel, we're told, came to David and complained that Judah had been given the right to invite the king back. The men of Judah replied that David was their kinsman and that they had every right to be the ones to welcome him home. The Israelites responded that as they had 10 tribes, they had 10 shares in the kingship. And they claimed that they were the first to suggest that David return at all. No, it was us. You see where this is going to go. I think you already see it. In the end, we're told the men of Judah spoke more powerfully than the men of Israel. And this episode is faintly ridiculous. A dialogue between the men of Israel and the men of Judah, you can hardly take that at face value from the story. The presentation of the North and the South bickering over who had more right to honor David has no historical veracity whatsoever in this tale. It serves rather, I think, to suggest that Israel and Judah were each desperate to bring David back, a notion at odds with the reality that Israel had no other options and Judah was once again coerced into accepting David as the king. I think if they'd all had their way, David wouldn't return to the throne at all. So there seems to be little right now in the way to prevent David from finally making his way back to Jerusalem to resume his reign. One man, however, was displeased by David's return. Before David could even reach the capital city, a man named Sheba from the tribe of Benjamin declared Israel's independence. He said in 2 Samuel 20, "We have no portion in David, no share in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tent, O Israel," he declares. Now, Sheba pointedly used the terminology of kin-based landholding, portion, and share. This language is cleverly double-edged. It states that the northern tribes don't want to consider David's kingship to be authentic, part of their patrimony. At the same time, it reminds the Israelites that David is originally from Judah, and it's their problem to deal with. The final phrase, "every man to his tent," has military overtones and signals the dispersal of the army and the return to the traditional tribal life. It's like saying, at dawn, we breakfast, and then to battle. That's kind of the feel of it. So the Bible presents Sheba as a significant threat. Now, we've not heard about him before, but they're presenting him as this significant threat to David's kingship in the north. In reality, Sheba was always a lone revolutionary, and in the end, a rather pathetic one. Even if he'd been able to rouse Israel to rebellion, David had just defeated Israel's army at I've been saying this wrong, not Manaheim, it's Mahanaim. I can't say that right. It just doesn't feel right. Mahanaim. Mahan is usually like Irish man, McMahon. So Manaim, it's probably Manaim. Let's pronounce it that way. Manaim. I'm tired of the pronunciation. There you go, Manaim. With only his private royal army, David just defeated Manaim with his private army. Now that Israel's troops had returned to their homes, they would have to be mustered again to face David's same victorious warriors. But this time without Judah, which had returned its allegiance to David. So Sheba's revolt never really would have had any chance of success. In the end, it hardly mattered, since the rest of Israel had no idea that Sheba had declared a rebellion on their behalf. Could you imagine that? Imagine one guy, like standing up to our greatest enemy in the United States. Let's see, standing up in Russia, going to the Kremlin and declaring war on the Kremlin, on Russia from the United States when nobody else in the United States even knew he was doing it. and he had no power to back his words. So he declared rebellion on David on the behalf of Israel, for Israel, who had no idea he was doing it. So when David sought to squash this little uprising, he needed to do no more than simply hunt down Sheba. Even this, however, is an indication of how insecure David must have felt in his kingship. At the height of his power, he would have had nothing to fear from a guy like Sheba. Pfft, who's Sheba? Out there bellyaching, caterwauling in the woods. But his control was so tenuous right now that he needed to commit his weary troops to ensure that Sheba would go unheeded and and nobody do a thing that he said or take any heart by what he said. So along with Sheba, David still had one outstanding issue to deal with, and that's Amasa, who David had promised would take over for his cousin Joab. Now, if you remember the story of Abner, we can predict, and you already know how this is turning out. Remember Abner? He was the general under Ishbal, whom he had put on the throne in Israel in the north. And after a while, making that king, Abner sends word to David that he says, I'll give you all of Israel in the north and the throne and Ishbal's head if you grant me this, this, and this. And David agreed, and he goes to meet with David. David has Joab hunt him down and kill him. So right after the meeting. So, and of course, he's clean of that because Joab did it. Remember that? So you already know how this is going to end. Amasa may have been family, but he had sided with Absalom against David. He had survived the battle at Manaim. He still could be of some momentary use, but Judah had accepted David as the king, and Amasa was no longer of further use to David. See how David works? We know how he works by now. So during the pursuit of Sheba, David, we're told, gave Amasa instructions to muster the troops of Judah. It seems kind of bizarre. But the troops had just returned home, being immediately called up again, this time to fight not against David, but for him. Now remember, keep remembering, Israel is all comprised of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This is the southern tribes. So David would have been cause for significant resentment right now that they're remustering the troops. And so David was pursuing a single individual, Sheba. He hardly needed an entire tribal army to chase down one man. And to compound the matters, David is said to have given Amasa only 3 days to muster Judah's forces. An impossible task, even under the best of conditions. So when Amasa was unable to gather his assigned forces in time, according to the narrative, David sent Joab and Abishai with the Cherethites and the Pelethites to find Sheba. The two forces, the Judahites under Amasa and David's warriors under Joab, are said to have converged in Gibeon, an inauspicious location for the enemy of David, but it was there that Amasa would meet his end. The manner of his death, according to the Bible, was predictable. As in the case of Abner, Joab approached Amasa ostensibly for a private conversation and stabbed him through the abdomen with a javelin. So it might have been a sword. I added with a javelin because we were joking around about that a little bit on Friday. He stabbed Absalom in the chest with a javelin. And so the story tells us that the Judahite army stopped short upon seeing Amasa's corpse in the road, which was quickly moved into a field and covered. At this point, Judah's army, in a declaration of allegiance to David, continued to follow Joab after Sheba. So it gets complex, and all these little twists and turns in these stories. It gets sometimes it's not hard to follow. You have to kind of keep up with who's doing what to whom. But what seems to be at the core of everything is David eliminating the people that are problems for his reign. So there's so much to this story that doesn't ring true. It seems impossible for David to have mustered Judah's troops, even under Amasa. there would be no need to do so in any case. The 3 days Amasa is given has a distinctly literary ring to it, as we have seen elsewhere. David hardly needed an excuse to send his private army after Sheba. It would have been the obvious choice from the beginning, with its smaller numbers, greater mobility, and experience, and it's equally unlikely that Amasa's troops would ever have caught up to Joab's, since the tribal army would have moved far more slowly than David's militia. And so the sighting of the meeting at Gibeon is so inauspicious as to be suspicious. And the death scene is all too familiar. Finally, the denouement of the episode, Judah's declaration of allegiance, to Joab, appears to be a transparent attempt to have the people ratify Amasa's death and David's kingship. So, Amasa, gone. So there's no question that Amasa died, but everything else in the story is open to doubt. It's almost certain that David never sent Amasa after Sheba, but rather sent only Joab and Abishai and their men. Whether Joab killed Amasa, wherever and whenever the death took place, it's impossible to know. Joab is constantly made out to be the murderous one on the behalf of David in the Bible story, for the sake of preserving David's reputation, as in this case. But it's possible that he really was willing to act as David's personal hitman. I have no doubt. We all know people all throughout history that act as personal hitmen. So for the monarch or the chieftain or whoever it might be. So no one had commanded a rebel army against David could be permitted to survive is the whole lesson to be learned here. And so Joab and Abishai eventually caught Sheba at the far northern city of Abel in the land of Maacah. To get there, David's men had to pass through the entire northern territory of Israel. That they were able to do so without any difficulty suggests both that Sheba's rebellion had no broader effect and that the north had officially returned to David's side. As for the city of Abel itself, it stood outside Israelite territory. It was at the source of one of the major tributaries of the Jordan. And so we have already noted the kind of treatment that a city housing a rebel would expect to face, and in this case was no different. Even if the city was in a foreign land, Joab besieged Abel, began battering its wall, intent on killing Sheba, even if it meant only destroying the city, also destroying the city. But the residents of Abel had nothing at stake in this conflict. They didn't care about Sheba or his revolt. I'm trying to think as I'm talking, I'm trying to think of a good example that parallels this guy, but they don't care. He's one of theirs, but they don't care. He's already put them on the hook with his own, fist chain shaking and fist shaking, chain rattling. But so they had no stake in the conflict. They didn't care about Sheba. They didn't care about his revolt. They were, in fact, perfectly happy to hand Sheba over. And they even did the dirty work for Joab, since all they handed over was Sheba's head. Here you go. Here he is, unceremoniously tossing it over the wall. With Sheba's death, his revolt ended, for he was its only member. Could you imagine that? It's almost got a ring of black comedy to it. Here he comes. Pew, and the head shoots over the wall. To live in olden times where things were simpler and easier. So imagine if you could do that to your political opponents today. Well, ISIS did. We didn't like it from them. So anyway, let's move on. I'm making no point at all. So once David returned to power in Jerusalem, sitting back on the throne, he had to deal with only the matter of his concubines. The matter of the concubines, with whom Absalom had slept in the standard pronouncement of a coup. And had Absalom survived, no doubt they would have been sent away with him, just as Ahinoam, his mother, had been sent away with David. But with Absalom dead, the concubines were of no use to anyone. They were merely a living reminder of Absalom's rebellion. So here's the prince of Israel revolting against his father, pulling a coup, sleeping with his father's concubines. It wasn't their fault. So David imprisoned them in the palace for the rest of their lives. I don't know what the purpose of that is. I don't know why the tradition said that or the custom said. What do you guys think? Why would David have taken these concubines and imprisoned them in the palace for the rest of their lives? At least they weren't in the dungeon. I don't know if he really had a dungeon in the palace, but he's got them imprisoned for the rest of their lives. Maybe, um, maybe he at first wanted to see if there were going to be any offspring born, I suppose. But other than that, so he has them in prison. So Absalom's rebellion revealed much about David's power in Israel. In victory over Absalom, David had proved once again that he had the military prowess to maintain his authority. Even against the tribal armies of all of Israel, David and his personal, professional militia were dominant. And the basis for his rule remained the same as it had been when he first took power. David still ruled as a conqueror. At the same time, the fact of a popular uprising demonstrated that despite anything he had accomplished during his years on the throne, David remained deeply disliked throughout the whole land. And over the generations, Israel would come to venerate David as the ideal king. But in his own time, he was never loved. People didn't like him. David would never again, after this Absalom episode, regain or reach the heights of power that he had attained before Absalom's revolt. Perhaps because of the strain of trying to maintain power in the face of subjects whom he now knew despised him. Perhaps because of the realization that with Absalom's rebellion and death, his legacy was in question. Perhaps simply because of the fatigue of decades of hard fighting to gain and keep the throne in Israel. Perhaps all of these factors rolled into one contributed to the fact that the rest of David's reign, what little remained of it at this point, witnessed a king in inexorable decline. The man who had once controlled everyone and everything around him would find himself being the one controlled. And most humiliating for David, who had always used his wives as mere pawns, Ahinoam, Abigail, and Michal, his final fall from power would be at the hands of a woman. Her name was Bathsheba. And that was really the main point we're going to get to tonight is Bathsheba. So here you've got David. You can see that David is not revered by the people in Israel. They don't really like him. When they saw the opportunity to lose him as king, they were all behind Absalom. Now, they didn't get behind Sheba's revolt because he was probably just a hothead, spouting off. Nobody supported him, and nobody wanted to support him, especially against the army of David. So Ron Frisbee says the Bible does highlight his failings, showing he was capable of corruption. Rather or not, if he truly repented is the question. I think a lot of his story was written by apologies. Is it true? Now, are you talking about David there or maybe somebody else? David for certain. Chris, yeah, there are historical artifacts from King David. He did exist. However, anything can be written about anyone. That's very true. So he did exist as a king in the Middle East, in Israel. It's just Israel was not this glorious golden kingdom that we're taught it was in the Bible. It was a lot smaller than that. David is kind of like a King Arthur in that respect, in that not a lot, there's nothing about King Arthur that's solid archaeological fact. There's supposition and things like that he was maybe a composite of several people. But with David, you've actually got artifacts that say the house of David existed, 2 of them that are known. You find all kinds of ring seals and things like that. So he would most likely have them killed, I bet, but that would have looked bad the way the Bible portrayed him. Of course, But we see David is responsible for many, many political deaths that we're told of, that the Bible tries to wipe him clean of, which really cements the fact that he was behind them. So let's move into this David in decline. The roots of his final fall from grace can be traced back to much earlier in his reign. Remember, I mentioned the other night, the story of Bathsheba and David doesn't take place next. It was a little earlier. It's to a time when he was at the height of his considerable power, and it seemed that nothing could stand in his way. David hardly could have foreseen the long-term consequences of his actions, but the end of his kingship over Israel began when he decided to take Bathsheba as his wife. Now, there's a good lesson for all of us to learn. Many times we could hardly foresee the long-term consequences of actions. David was no different. His affair with Bathsheba is one of the most famous parts of the David story, next to the whole David and Goliath story. His lust for Bathsheba, his murder of her husband Uriah, his condemnation by Nathan the prophet, his realization of his guilt, the episode humanizes David in a way seldom seen elsewhere in the biblical narrative of his life. The story is a model of the biblical doctrine that sin must be followed by punishment and repentance. The biblical model. So even the great David made mistakes and suffered the consequences. Everyone can relate to this, which is why the story has had such an effect on readers over the centuries. But as we saw in the case of the legendary battle against Goliath, sometimes the most famous stories are the most open to doubt. Throughout the entire David story, now, let's get to this. Bathsheba. Throughout his entire story, we've seen that when the biblical authors go to great lengths to emphasize that something must be the case, we have reason to suspect exactly the opposite. We saw this sort of emphasis in the claims that David was completely loyal to Saul, and that David had no hand in the deaths of Nabal, or of Saul, or Jonathan, or Abner, or Amnon, or Absalom, or Amasa. The literary clue in all of these instances is the attempt by the writers to establish the Bible's case from as many angles as possible. It's not just saying David didn't do this. David didn't do this for this reason, this, and this. So all these things pointing to David's innocent of this. So it's this attempt in a literary fashion to over-establish his innocence and everything. The literary clue in all of these instances is the multi-angled approach. All of Saul's confrontations with David were told repeatedly that David is innocent and Saul's wrath was unjustified. For every death, not only is someone else to blame, Joab, an unarmed Amalekite, even God himself, but David is always somewhere else when the death occurs, but it always benefits him. The biblical authors want to leave nothing to chance, to allow no room for misunderstanding. Ironically, it is their very insistence that, for the suspicious reader, undermines their case. And we find this same insistence at work in the story of David's affair with Bathsheba. Now, we all know the story. In the Bathsheba story, the point to which the biblical authors want to lead us, and they do successfully, as is evident by how universally accepted the story has been over the millennia, is that Solomon was David's son. Whoa. Okay, here you go, folks. Here's where there's going to be a little bit of a ball coming in from left field to throw at you. Why did they go to such great pains to clear David of all wrong, to show that he was forgiven and all of this? It was to establish that she gives birth to David's son, Solomon, the great Solomon. The biblical account begins with the notice that David witnessed Bathsheba bathing. This isn't merely a voyeuristic element in the narrative. We're told that she had just purified herself after her period. Second Samuel says. So David's not just looking at her. It's not a story of David noticed her and he's a voyeur. The text actually tells you that she had just had her period and she's now in her purified stage, which means basically was approaching ovulation. Thus, she wasn't merely bathing. She was undergoing the ritual bath to cleanse herself after menstruation. This is a common ancient Near Eastern practice, the details of which are found in the Bible in Leviticus. Now, the key to understanding the import of this notice is that such purification took place approximately 7 days after a woman's period had ended. In other words, when she would be at her most fertile. I got to share this with you. I wasn't supposed to have kids medically, according to my doctor, many years ago. Almost 30 years ago now, I was told that. My wife and I at the time were trying to have kids. So what would we do? We would do all the things the doc said, and we'd always look at the calendar to find out, when are you probably ovulating? Boom, boom, boom. You women, you all know how this works. So the Bible is going out of its way to establish for you that this is the stage in her menstrual cycle that Bathsheba is at right now. She's had it. It's 7 days later. Woof, it's almost time to ovulate. So this in turn makes it inevitable, the result of David sleeping with her. The woman conceived, it says, and she sent word to David, I'm pregnant. And now we have to wonder, however, at how the Bible authors would have known this detail about Bathsheba's most private life. Now, of course, I use that argument a lot. It could be that these things are told to the writers by a third party, by David or by Bathsheba, or by somebody in the personal know. That's a possibility. But this is another instance where the biblical authors wouldn't have known this detail. Women did not only bathe for the purpose of postmenstrual purification. So how would the authors know in the first place that David saw her when she was bathing? These details are unverifiable, but that they're necessary for establishing Bathsheba's fertility at precisely the moment that David slept with her. So the Bible goes on and then tells us that David actually tried to extricate himself from this potentially embarrassing situation. He had Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, one of David's army officers, sent back from the battle against Ammon, where Joab and the military were besieging the Ammonite capital, Rabbah. So when Uriah arrived, David encouraged him, go spend some time at home. Go to bathe, go see your wife. To bathe his feet is a euphemism for sex, by the way. It says in the passage, go home, spend some time, go bathe your feet. There's a euphemism for stoop the wife. You've been in battle. But Uriah, despite David's repeated urgings, refuses to go anywhere, but to the military encampment near the palace. And this episode, too, kind of suffers from an excess of seemingly private information. David's instructions to Uriah to go sleep with his wife, as well as Uriah's refusal, should, in theory, have been known only to David and Uriah. But these details are needed for the reader to appreciate the point of the story. Not that they couldn't have been told these things later, but they're specifically there to appreciate the point of the story that's being told. David wanted Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba so that Uriah would think himself to be the father of the child that Bathsheba was carrying. Thus, the Bible presents David as trying to preserve Uriah's honor, but failing. Now, the biblical story tells us that Uriah didn't go home. Instead, he spent his time in the very public place among the other military officers in the front of the palace. In this way, the authors announce that there were plenty of witnesses who could testify to the fact that Uriah never went home. The child most certainly could not be his. So here, as elsewhere, the biblical authors are trying to put a particular spin on an event for which the basic facts really aren't in dispute. In this case, the facts are that Bathsheba was once Uriah's wife, was now David's wife, and that she bore a son, who, though no one knew it, would one day become David's successor on the throne. This is the essence of the biblical narrative. But it's been overlaid with the details that betray their non-historical origins. As with other episodes from David's life, the aspects invented by the Bible authors are identifiable by both insistence on a particular interpretation and the introduction of unverifiable private moments. These two features are present in almost every verse of the story we've examined so far. Look into history. How many historical accounts do you read where these private, intimate conversations and details are known? You know the generalizing of it after the fact, but you don't know the intimacies of it. So, whatever the underlying truth might be, and we're going to get to that shortly, by the way, the biblical story appears to be a literary creation. It's fiction, written on top of the account. So as the story continues, Uriah returns to the battlefront, and David took the pregnant Bathsheba into his harem. This meant that when Uriah came home from battle, he would find that his wife suddenly belonged to another man. David knew only one solution to most of life's problems. What was it, folks? You know it already. What's his solution here? Uriah's got to die. So the Bible presents David's decision to have Uriah killed as the result of Uriah's refusal to sleep with Bathsheba, and as if it were the only option David had left. Yet the two do not logically follow. The authors had already established beyond a doubt that Bathsheba's baby was David's child. What difference did it make now if Uriah lived or died? The child would still be David's. And Uriah, who had not slept with Bathsheba, would know that something was amiss. Uriah's death has nothing to do with paternity and everything to do with marriage. We understand this from the prophet Nathan's famous encounter with David. Nathan approaches him and recounts the parable of the rich man who takes the poor man's only lamb, even though the rich man has so many of his own. And David, when he hears the story, is angry because the rich man has committed a great wrong. Nathan then retorts with the dramatic accusation, "You are the man." That's in 2 Samuel 12:7. You know what? Just for the hell of it, I think we should read this. Listen to this. I'm going to look it up here. Hold on. 2 Samuel 12. Here we go. This is in the NIV, the New International Version of the Bible, which is what I used when I was in ministry and when I was teaching. The Lord sent Nathan, the prophet, to David. When he came to him, he said, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him." David, the passage says, burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die." Spoken like a true warrior, a fighter. "He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if I had this all, and if all this had been too little, I would have given you more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, here's the key: the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says: out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. Now, this is before the rebellion of Absalom. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and will give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. And after Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed that his attendants were whispering amongst themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied, he is dead. Then David got up from the ground after he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and at his request they served him food, and he ate. His attendants asked him, why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat. David answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live, but now that he's dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will never return to me. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went into her and made love to her. She gave birth to a son. They named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah. Okay, and then it goes on. So there's his regnal name and his birth name. So that's the story we have. Yeah, King James was the only version I was told that was the right version too. It's funny how a monarch in 1611, King James, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was responsible for having the King James Bible written, but that's the only authorized version. When it's, I don't buy it. I didn't at the time either. So there's the story. He says, you're the man, says Nathan. You put Uriah the Hittite to the sword and took his wife. But there's nothing here about the baby in Bathsheba's womb. We have to imagine that Uriah's death happened in a manner quite close to its biblical depiction. According to the story, David sent Joab a message telling him to have Uriah placed in the front of the lines in heavy fighting, and then have the troops around Uriah fall back to leave him standing alone where he was sure to be killed. Joab didn't quite follow David's instructions to the letter, perhaps because he realized just how obvious such a ploy would be. Instead, he sent Uriah and a number of other officers to a particularly well-defended area of the besieged city, where many of them, including Uriah, were killed. Now, David's response to the news put into words the low value he placed on the lives of others, even his most loyal officers. Don't be upset about the matter. The sword consumes all equally, says David. That's in 2 Samuel 11. In other words, David's happy to sacrifice a number of his best men to ensure that he'll have a clear path to taking the woman of his choice. Everything about this seems realistic enough, with one exception. The Bible tells us that the message instructing Joab to have Uriah killed was delivered by Uriah himself. David wrote a letter to Joab, which he sent with Uriah. That's in the passage. This claim is necessary because the authors have just had David bring Uriah to Jerusalem to sleep with his wife. If that story was invented, so too the notion that Uriah was the one to deliver his own death warrant. The elimination of this feature does little to soften the cruelty of David in this matter. A man died for David's lust. In fact, several men died, thinking that they were fighting for their king, but they were merely dying to cover his ass. The biblical story takes a surprising twist at the end of Nathan's oracle. Not only will David be punished for his sins by experiencing Absalom's revolt, as we saw in the previous section that we talked about, but the child about to be born to him and Bathsheba is going to die. God is going to take the life of the innocent child to pay for David's sin. So the story of the infant's death is famous and it's moving. David fasts and he prays for the 7 days that the child would live, but stops once the baby's died, much to his servant's confusion, as we just read in that passage. His explanation is authentically touching. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, because I thought, who knows? Yahweh may have mercy on me, and the child might live. But now that he's dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I'll go to him, but he will never return to me. That's 2 Samuel 12, 22, and 23, which we just read. It's a recognizably parental scene, one that still resonates as realistic today, but we have grown accustomed by now to David's public displays of grief over Saul and Jonathan, over Abner, over Absalom. And we've come to realize that an emotionally accurate scene is not necessarily historically accurate. The death of the firstborn son is followed immediately in the Bible by the birth of a second son to David and Bathsheba, who it turns out to be David's successor, the almost legendary Solomon. The story of the death of David and Bathsheba's son, their firstborn, to put it gently, is pretty bizarre. First, it's odd that the child has no name given to him. It was the custom to name the newborn immediately after birth, as we see in virtually every birth narrative in the Bible. Names held great importance in the ancient world. They defined one's relationship to kin or to the deity, and they often reflected the manner of the child's birth, like in the naming of Jacob's sons offers a good example. So a nameless child would be an anomaly. Second, it's the prophet Nathan's prophetic announcement of the infant's imminent death entails a logical inconsistency in this story. When David repents for taking Bathsheba and having Uriah killed, we're told, Nathan responds, Yahweh has removed your punishment. You shall not die. However, since you've spurned Yahweh by this deed, the child about to be born to you is going to die instead. Now, Nathan implies that the punishment for David's sin will not be inflicted on David, but will be transferred to the newborn child. Yet nowhere in the preceding oracle predicting Absalom's rebellion is it ever said that David would die. In Absalom's rebellion, it's never said that David would die. You get that? Nowhere in the preceding oracle predicting Absalom's rebellion is it ever said that David would die. Because the prophet also predicted that at the same time. Your own house shall rise up against you. And third and most important, the death of the firstborn child renders the lengthy preceding account of its Conception, moot. If the firstborn son was to die, then why go to all the bother of making it clear that it was David's child? All of the demonstrations that David must be the father, Bathsheba's purification, Uriah's refusal to sleep with his wife, end up being a false lead, a blind motif. What difference does it make in the end if the baby is Uriah's or David's? Doesn't matter. The child has no effect on the larger story. Once Solomon is the second born, long after Uriah's death, and his paternity therefore established beyond a doubt, the first child's paternity is a non-issue. The biblical authors do not waste words. If they wanted to make clear that David and Bathsheba's firstborn son was really David's child, they must have had a reason to do so. And when we read the narrative, we expect that this unborn child will be of great importance, just from the amount of space the Bible devotes to the story of its conception, all the way from telling us that Bathsheba was fertile now, all the way through that story, and the proof of its paternity. Stories like these are reserved for major figures. Even David himself doesn't have a birth story like this. Then the sudden death of the child renders the efforts of the biblical authors meaningless. All that verbal effort is put into the account when it doesn't matter. So all of this has led many scholars, maybe correctly so, to conclude that the account of the death of David and Bathsheba's firstborn, beginning with the last words of Nathan's oracle, is a later insertion into the original story. It's an edit. It may even be a successful representation of parental grief, but it falls on almost every other level. It fails. If it's exercised, then Solomon is the first and only child that Bathsheba bore in David's house. All of the arguments for David's paternity of the firstborn then make much more sense. Now there are arguments for Solomon being David's son. That's what they're doing here. They're trying to establish that Solomon is the second born. He is David's son in place of the firstborn that's died. Now, I want you to think about this and think deeply about what they're doing here. If it's it's clear enough why it would be important for the biblical authors to establish this fact. Solomon followed David on the throne. And if he were not really David's son, then he would not be a rightful heir with all the natural rights that come with standard royal succession. He would be a usurper, and the legitimacy of his reign would thus be undermined. But why would the biblical authors feel the need to make this case? None of David's other sons are provided with detailed proofs of paternity, and no one would ever question them. Someone must have thought that Solomon was in fact not David's son. And it's to this charge that the Bible is responding with this whole narrative of the birth of the firstborn that died. Why would Solomon's descent from David be in question? The most significant issue is Solomon's name. It was the custom in Israel for mother to name her children. We see this, for example, in the naming of Jacob's 12 sons by their mothers, Leah and Rachel. Bathsheba, therefore, was the one to name her son Solomon. The child was born, as the Bible admits, after Uriah's death in Ammon, to which we'll return to that in just a second here. I got more to say about that. It's thus telling that Bathsheba would name her newborn son Solomon, which means his replacement. Bathsheba gives her son a name that memorializes her deceased husband. If David were the father, this would be problematic. In the first place, we would expect David's son to be named after him, if anyone. Beyond this, we may well wonder what David would make of his son being named in honor of Bathsheba's first husband. Such a name would practically announce to the world that Bathsheba's affection still belonged to Uriah. So it may have been the mother's right to name her child, but it's hard to imagine David allowing Uriah's memory to live on in David's son. Okay, you following that? It's the discomfort that such a situation produces that probably led Solomon to being given a second name in the Bible, Jedediah. Perhaps lost in translation is the wordplay inherent in his name, Jedediah, beloved of Yahweh, is what that means. It's etymologically, oh hell, etymologically, boom, etymologically linked to David, beloved. This is the second name for Solomon, which is never used again, is an attempt to erase the connection to Uriah and replace it with a connection to David. There's another reason to suspect that Solomon was not really David's son. Bathsheba wasn't merely a random beautiful woman. She was the daughter of Eliam, one of David's warriors, and Eliam in turn was the son of Ahithophel, the same Ahithophel who defected from David during Absalom's rebellion. Solomon was Ahithophel's great-grandson. Now, if Ahithophel thought that his great-grandson stood in line for succession to the throne, he hardly would have supported Absalom, which happened later, remember, which would all but guarantee that Ahithophel's offspring would never attain the kingship. Ahithophel would defect to Absalom, only if he had no reason to think that Solomon might someday be king, because Solomon was not one of David's sons. He was not David's offspring. So the biblical authors, you're wrapping your mind around this? The great David we're learning about. And now we find that very possibly Solomon, his son, is not his son at all, not his flesh and blood. So the biblical authors have tried their best to disguise Solomon's true father. They created a scenario in which Bathsheba is virtually obligated by biology to become pregnant by David. Then they create a story in which David acts on the assumption that he is Solomon's father, and which Uriah acts in a way that publicly ensures this to be the case. But the authors could not overcome two unchangeable facts: Solomon's name and Bathsheba's genealogy. Both of these testify to Solomon being Uriah's son, not David. And how the Messiah is supposed to be from the root of David. But what if Solomon isn't David's son? The overstory seems to indicate that this is so. No matter what stories the authors invented, Solomon's name still identified him as Uriah's son. And it's safe to say, given the Bible's detailed rendering of an alternative scenario, that there were those in Israel in David's day who recognized this fact. And by the way, some might say that when she names Solomon his replacement, she's not talking about a dead son. They would not have named a child as a replacement for my dead son, especially in a royal line. So in case that popped up in your head. There were those in Israel in David's day who recognized this fact. They got it. They knew what was going on here. The story of the death of the firstborn son was created and inserted to address this lingering problem. Not only does the story make it chronologically impossible for Solomon to be Uriah's son, but it provides quite cleverly a new explanation for Solomon's name. Now he could be seen as the replacement, not for Uriah, but for his ill-fated older sibling. This sort of naming is known from the Bible and elsewhere in the Near East. In Genesis 4, oh, this is where Seth comes in. Eve gives her third son the name Seth, meaning God has provided me with another offspring in place of Abel, who had died at the hands of Cain. The 8th century BCE Assyrian king Sennacherib, famous for his attacks on Judah during the reign of King Hezekiah, bears a name meaning sin, has replaced brothers for me. That's the Mesopotamian deity, Sin. And the biblical authors provided an alternative referent for Solomon's name, and thereby removed the last potential link between Solomon and Uriah. They did so, however, at the cost of a narrative logic. And in compounding the Bible's insistence that Solomon, despite his name, could not be Uriah's son, these authors lead us only more firmly to the conclusion that he was. So, the biblical authors present David and Bathsheba's affair as the story of their children, when in reality, the affair was just like any other. It was about sex. The Bible's presentation of Bathsheba as unknown to David is probably false. Most likely, David had known her, probably had his eye on her for nearly her entire life. She was, after all, the wife of one of his chosen warriors, the daughter of one of his chosen warriors, and the granddaughter of his trusted advisor. Do you think he didn't know who she was? Where the Bible tale says he didn't know who she was? This is especially true of women, as Ahinoam, Abigail, and Michal could attest. We have to imagine that the army and Uriah engaged in a lengthy siege abroad. David saw the opportunity to take her for himself, the beautiful Bathsheba, whom he'd long coveted and who was probably bathing where he could see her from the rooftop, knowing he could see her. It was undoubtedly a surprise to discover that she was already pregnant with Uriah's child. This is why the Bible went to such great pains to say she had gone through her menstrual cycle and was just going through her purifying bathing and was now fertile. But this would have been little more than a passing disappointment. After all, he had little invested in the baby, who was not his own. Bathsheba would enter David's harem as one of his many wives and concubines. The child would become whatever he would become. It was, so David thought, not really any of his concern. He just wanted the sex part. So Solomon had no deceased older brother. He was the first child born to Bathsheba after David took her into his harem. But he was not David's son. He was Uriah's son. And the Bible's attempts to persuade us otherwise are part of the standard biblical genre of apology. But this isn't an apology for David, it's an apology for Solomon. Solomon would become king after David, but he had no bloodline right to the throne. Just as David, the pro-David authors, created an apology for how David came to reign in a place of Saul. So two pro-Solomonic authors created this apology for how Solomon came to reign in place of David. How this actually happened, we're going to get into. The Bible very much wants us to think that it was a natural succession, the son following the father. But you know what? Remember, there's 5 other brothers out there, older brothers that are sons of David's. And so we're going to get into that, not tonight, but next time, as it's already 10:40. Now, there is no, there's a repeat playing tonight on the Situation Room. Rocky is unavailable tonight. I'm not going to take it on tonight. And so we're playing a repeat tonight. So you can go listen. It's probably one you've already heard. Probably a very good one. That starts in about 20 minutes. So how do you feel about this? I'm really curious. How do you feel about what was just laid on you? Because the first time I really studied this, and tried to come to terms with this as being an apologetic about Solomon, it blew my head up because of several things. One was that we always thought Solomon to be the son of David. So that fact, it's unimportant to us. What does it matter if he was or wasn't? Except the linkage of the Messiah, the messianic line, to the seed of David. He had to sprout from the seed of David, the line of David. They show both Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the New Testament, as linked to the line of David and trace her back to David. The same with her husband, Joseph, who was not supposed to be the physical father of Jesus, but was Mary's husband, that he also, as the stepfather, had his line go back to the line of David. Because the prophecies after the time of David said that the Messiah must sprout from the rod of Jesse, David being the son of Jesse. The seed of David was part of the messianic line. What do you do with that if you learn that suddenly the line of David ended with David's death? Solomon was not his son. What do you do with that? That's it, Brian. There's the question of the earthly father or the heavenly. So it becomes a spiritual thing. Or it becomes a metaphoric thing. So there it is. It's an interesting question. So let's see. I'm just scrolling back a little. Ron said it's about Christ. Adam was the first flesh. Yeshua was the second, the spirit. The Old Testament was Christ hidden. The New Testament, Christ revealed. The Bible is a parabolic allegory. And you're right about that. So, just going on. I'm just looking back. Becky says all answers ever needed are within me, not in a book. That's from my perspective. Same here. I believe that. Da Vinci Code is a fun book. Very true. The Bible is not the book for me, says Becky. Respect your decision. I agree with Jeff on this, says Chris Jones. It's their playbook and useful for nothing much else. We can know their tactics and respond accordingly. There you go. Don't Christians dedicate sacrifice to their offspring at the altar? Metaphorically, maybe. Let's see. See if there's anything else here I might be missing. Philip Blair said the Basque people are very superstitious about the names of everything. I'm not sure the context of that. I've heard that, and I'm not sure if I understand what it has to do with the Basque people and why they have that superstition. If I had seen that when I was talking, I might be able to place it right into what I was talking about. But in context. Yeah, Ron Frisbee, the sword never left David's house. Israel has been in conflict ever since. That's true. And his personal house, too. Let's see. Chris Jones says we need kings like we need holes in our head. There is that. Anarchist. So, let's see. Sorry, Suzuki. If anything, the story of David should show we don't need an earthly king, says Brian. Yeah, look at how disappointing David ended up being. Let's see. Chris says there was only one version while I was growing up. It didn't matter. Couldn't read it anyway. Never made sense. That's the King James. I always thought if the Bible is supposed to be so practical to people, why did we only choose one of the versions written, 400 years ago when we all talked funny and talked different? We did not say hitherto and wherefore unto, and thou and yea, verily in sooth. We don't talk that way anymore. But yeah, I was told the King James was supposed to be the only good version. Well, now they have the new King James, by the way, the revised King James, and it was slightly more modern English. What a waste of time. If you're going to read it so you understand it. Let's see. In natural law, the son follows the condition of the father. The question is, we already read that. Brian said, of which father, earthly or heavenly? Right. So, yeah, it is a new angle. It's refreshing on one hand. On the other hand, it's a little disturbing. It's disturbing because we were led to believe one thing when something else altogether is what exists. There is an apology written over the top to gloss coat the story, to make it into something it was not, for a purpose. So there you go. Let's end that here. I want to thank you all for being here. This, for me, it's inspiring for me. It's fun for me. It's educating for me to go through this material. And I hope that you're enjoying this and that you get some benefit out of this, that it means something. And God forbid that I'm wrong and I get struck by a lightning bolt while I'm sitting here talking to you. Chris says, isn't it like most everything else? You're told one thing to find the opposite true. Yeah, ain't that the truth? So much of what I thought I believed was true doesn't ring true anymore. So anyway, make up your minds on this stuff. I hope you're enjoying it enough to keep coming back and hearing. There's a little bit left to this. We have a few more lessons, and depending on how long-winded I get or how slowly I talk, will depend on how much longer the series is going to go, because we're going to bring it all the way up to David's death and the fallout of David's death. So the story we talked about tonight, Bathsheba and David, was something I had pulled out, and it's back earlier in the story is when it happened, which laid the groundwork for Absalom's revolt and all of that to come later. So thanks for being here. Go check out my stuff. I could use the work coming in as an artist. So go to my scottallenroberts.com and you can see all my work, the kind of stuff I do, graphic design to illustration to, you name it. It's there. You can go see my website. Also go to streamingtalkradio.com. I'm not sure if Audrey's here anymore. I haven't seen her for a bit. So go to streamingtalkradio.com. And if you scroll down the page, you'll see the Son of a Patriot link. Go ahead and click on that. And you can get your Meatball Army gear there. And you can also get all the stuff I put together, especially the shirt for this series on David. You'll find it there. So go check it out. See the designs I've created. Get yourself some stuff. Helps me continue to do what I do. So thanks for being here. We'll see you again tomorrow night when we're going to hit more of this again. I appreciate your being here. I love you all. It means a lot to me. You take your time to be here. See you tomorrow.